write an expression as a single trig ratio. So in A, there's 2 trig ratios. In B, there's 2 trig ratios. And evaluate if possible. So in A, you've got cos squared pi over 4 minus sine squared pi over 4. And if you looked at that and said to yourself, I know pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, so I could evaluate this right away, that wouldn't be wrong. But what they're wanting you to start to be able to do is to say, if you have an expression, do a quick check. Is there a formula that matches that? And for A, when you have cos squared of something minus sine squared of that same thing, we do have a formula that matches. You can see that that's one of the cos 2 alpha formulas. So I can rewrite this whole thing, which is the left-hand or right-hand side of that formula, and I can write it as cos 2 times whatever alpha is. And if I do that and simplify that, then this just becomes cos of pi over 2. And it may be a little bit less calculations than we would have had to do originally. Now, if you think about your x-coordinate on your unit circle at pi over 2, that's equal to 0. Which, again, maybe you could see that directly from the original question, because this would be root 2 over 2 squared minus root 2 over 2 squared. You would get 0 that way as well. Now, in part B, when we look at the formula, here we've got 2 tan alpha over tan squared alpha minus 1. And if we look at our formula on our formula sheet, our formula on our formula sheet says tan 2 alpha is equal to 2 tan alpha 1 minus tan squared alpha. So our formula and the expression that's given right now are not quite the same. So in order to use that substitution, we would need to make them exactly the same. Again, one of the things that we've noticed is when you have the same thing but in the wrong order, instead of 1 minus tan squared alpha, we have tan squared alpha minus 1, you can factor a negative out of that. So in part B, this expression, 2 tan pi over 6 over tan squared of pi over 6 minus 1 is the same as factoring a negative out of the bottom, which would give me 1 minus tan squared pi over 6 and if you factor a negative out of the bottom with a fraction, if you have a negative on the bottom of a fraction, a negative on the top of a fraction, that's the same as that entire fraction being negative. And now what's in the brackets matches up perfectly with our tan 2 alpha formula. So this will be negative tan 2 times pi over 6, which is negative tan, once we simplify that, pi over 3. That's on our unit circle. Tan of pi over 3 is root 3, so we would have negative root 3. I'm going to add a part C to this one, because the same thing happened in this one as does in part A. Pi over 6 is on your pi plate. If you wanted to evaluate this, you could have just done that directly. You could have plugged in root 3 over 3 for tan of pi over 6 and simplified it from there and got the same answer. So what happens in these questions, and this is what we're going to do here in part C, is sometimes you get ones that aren't on your pie plate. Okay? I'll give you two more. Let's do pi over 8. Definitely not on our pie plate. Cos squared pi over 8 minus sine squared pi over 8. So this one you couldn't plug in directly. But because it is in the right-hand side of a cos 2 alpha formula, you can change this to cos 2 times pi over 8. And that would reduce to cos of pi over 4 which is root 2 over 2. So these questions are generally worth 2 marks. You get 1 mark for recognizing the identity and substituting the identity correctly, and 1 mark for evaluating it. Okay? Do you remember yesterday we did pi over 12 questions? Pi over 12 questions are usually 3 to 4 marks each. So this right now would be a 3 or 4 mark question. And if I added another pi over 12 to this, it would be like a 6 to 8 mark question, but if this question shows up on the exam, it's still only worth 2 marks. So we have to be careful here, and this is why we want to have our formulas memorized and know them well, because sometimes you'll get questions like this one. And this one is designed to pull you in 2 different directions. It's designed to make you think of pi over 12 questions right away, okay, because you see the pi over 12. And if you do this as a pi over 12 question, you'd have to do enough work for like a 6 or 8 mark question. It's going to be a lot of work. But this one, and this is another important strategy, when you do a question on an exam and you see that it's 2 marks, the amount of marks tell you how much work you need to do, usually. You know, sometimes you get questions that are a little bit off, but if that's 2 marks, it shouldn't be like 2 full pages of work. There should be something quicker that you could do. And so this one, can you recognize that this is the right-hand side of our sine 2 alpha formula? And if we do that, we can say this is equal to sine 2 times pi over 12. And if we reduce that, that's just a sine of pi over 6. And this nicely becomes 1/2. All right, questions for practice. 4, 5, and 6.